There's a photograph that still exists, tucked away in the Marion County Sheriff's Department archives, of a man standing in front of a cabin door. His name was Sheriff Thomas Whitlock. The date written on the back is November 14th, 1953. He's smiling in that photograph, confident. His hand rests on his holster, his badge catching the pale autumn light. 23 minutes after that photograph was taken, Thomas Whitlock forced open the door to the Hollow Ridge cabin. He stepped inside alone, and what came out 3 days later wasn't entirely him anymore. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is documented history that the town of Ashmore, West Virginia tried very hard to forget. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Hollow Ridge cabin sat 9 miles outside Ashmore, deep in the Appalachian woods where the fog doesn't lift even in summer. It had been abandoned since 1938, when the Carver family disappeared without a trace. 15 years of silence. 15 years of locals driving past it with their eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge its existence. But in the fall of 1953, something changed. People started hearing things. Not screams exactly, worse than screams. A sound like someone trying to remember how to speak. A sound that came from inside the cabin at 3 in the morning. Every morning, for 6 consecutive nights. The calls came into the sheriff's office from hunters, from farmers whose land bordered the woods, from a postal carrier who swore he heard his dead mother's voice calling his name from that direction. Thomas Whitlock listened to these reports with the patience of a man who'd spent 20 years separating truth from hysteria in a mountain town where both ran equally deep. But when Eleanor Marsh, the local schoolteacher and the most rational person in 3 counties, came to his office with her hands shaking and told him she'd seen a light moving behind the cabin windows in a pattern that spelled out "help" in Morse code, Thomas knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. He assembled a small team. Deputy Frank Holloway, Dr. James Pritchard, the town physician, and Marcus Webb, a war veteran who'd seen things in Korea that made him, in Thomas's words, unshakable. They drove out to Hollow Ridge on that cold November morning with flashlights, a medical kit, and 2 loaded revolvers. The plan was simple: enter the cabin, investigate the source of the disturbances, document everything, be back before dark. Only Thomas Whitlock made it back, and when he did, he wouldn't stop screaming. To understand what happened to Sheriff Whitlock, you have to understand what the Hollow Ridge cabin was before 1953. You have to go back to 1938, to the Carver family, and to the thing they found buried beneath their floor. The Carvers weren't native to Ashmore. They'd moved there in 1936 from somewhere in Pennsylvania, though nobody could ever quite pin down exactly where. Daniel Carver was a carpenter. His wife, Ruth, kept to herself. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ages ranging from 6 to 12. They bought the property on Hollow Ridge for almost nothing because the land had a reputation. The previous owners, a family named the Driscolls, had left in the middle of the night in 1922, abandoning everything they owned. Before them, the land had sat vacant since the late 1800s, though county records showed at least 4 different families had tried to settle there, each leaving within a year. Daniel Carver either didn't know this history or didn't care. He rebuilt the cabin himself, reinforced the foundation, added a second room for the children. For 2 years, the Carvers lived quietly on Hollow Ridge. Ruth would come into town once a week for supplies. The children attended the 1-room schoolhouse. Daniel took carpentry jobs when they were available. They seemed, by all accounts, like an ordinary family trying to make a life in hard times. Then, in March of 1938, Daniel stopped coming to town. Ruth's weekly visits became sporadic, then stopped altogether. The children stopped attending school. When the schoolmaster, a man named Eugene Dalton, drove out to check on them, he found the cabin locked from the inside. He knocked for 20 minutes. He called their names. He heard movement inside, footsteps crossing the floor, but nobody answered. Through a gap in the curtains, he saw Ruth Carver standing in the center of the main room, perfectly still, staring at the floor. He said later that she was smiling, but it was the kind of smile you'd see on a corpse if someone had arranged its face wrong. Eugene reported this to the sheriff at the time. A man named Clayton Moss. Clayton drove out with 2 deputies on March 23, 1938. They found the front door unlocked this time. The cabin was empty, completely empty. Not just of people, but of everything. Furniture gone, clothes gone, food gone, as if the Carvers had never existed at all. But in the center of the main room, the floorboards had been torn up. Beneath them was a hole, roughly 4 feet deep and 6 feet across. The dirt at the bottom was disturbed, as if something had been buried there and recently dug up. The deputies found scratch marks on the interior walls, dozens of them, carved deep into the wood. They spelled out words, over and over, in different handwritings, including what appeared to be a child's hand. The words said, "It knows my name." Sheriff Moss ordered the cabin sealed. He filed a report stating the Carvers had abandoned their property. The case was never officially closed, but it was never actively investigated either. The cabin sat untouched for 15 years. The hole beneath the floor remained open, and the scratch marks remained on the walls, visible to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to look through the windows. Thomas Whitlock had read Clayton Moss's report. He'd read it multiple times. He knew exactly what he was walking into on November 14th, 1953, and he went anyway. They arrived at Hollow Ridge at 9:47 in the morning. The fog was so thick that Deputy Holloway had to use the car's headlights, even though the sun had been up for hours. When they parked 30 yards from the cabin, Marcus Webb was the first to notice the smell. He described it later as something between wet leather and spoiled meat, but with a chemical sweetness underneath that made your throat close up. Dr. Pritchard said it reminded him of a morgue where the refrigeration had failed. Thomas Whitlock took the photograph then, the one that still exists. He handed his camera to Deputy Holloway and stood in front of the cabin door, hand on his holster, trying to project the confidence a sheriff was supposed to have. In the photograph, you can see the cabin behind him. Single story. Dark wood, 2 windows flanking the door, both curtained from the inside, despite the fact that the place had been abandoned for 15 years. If you look closely at the photograph, and people have looked very closely over the decades, you can see something odd about the left window. There's a shape behind the curtain. It's blurred, indistinct, but it's there. And it's too tall to be anything that should have been inside an empty cabin. They approached the door together, all 4 men. Thomas tried the handle first, locked. He knocked, following procedure, even though procedure made no sense here. No answer. He called out, identifying himself as law enforcement, requesting that anyone inside make themselves known. The only response was a sound from deep within the cabin. Dr. Pritchard described it as a wet clicking, like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of stones. Deputy Holloway said it sounded like fingernails tapping against glass in a very specific rhythm. Thomas made the decision to force entry. He put his shoulder against the door. The wood splintered easily, far more easily than it should have for a door that had been locked and sealed for 15 years. The door swung inward, and the smell that had been faint outside became overwhelming. Marcus Webb vomited immediately. Dr. Pritchard covered his face with his handkerchief, but Thomas Whitlock stepped inside, and the other 3 men followed. The interior of the cabin was wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate later. The hole in the floor was still there, exactly as Sheriff Moss had described it 15 years earlier. But the hole was deeper now, much deeper. Deputy Holloway shined his flashlight into it and couldn't find the bottom. The beam just disappeared into darkness that seemed to curve away from the light. The scratch marks on the walls had multiplied. They covered every surface now, floor to ceiling. Thousands of repetitions of the same phrase, "It knows my name." But there were new words too, carved more recently, the wood still pale where it had been gouged. These new words said, "It knows your name too." Dr. Pritchard found the first piece of evidence that something had been living in the cabin. In the corner of the room, there was a pile of clothes. Men's clothes, women's clothes, children's clothes, all folded neatly and stacked in order of size. On top of the pile was a sheriff's badge, not Thomas Whitlock's badge, an older one. When they examined it later, they found it had belonged to Clayton Moss, the sheriff who'd investigated the Carver disappearance in 1938. Clayton Moss had died of a heart attack in 1941, 3 years after the Carvers vanished. He'd been buried in the Ashmore Cemetery with full honors. His badge should have been buried with him. Marcus Webb found the second piece of evidence. In what had been the children's room, there were drawings on the wall, child's drawings, done in what appeared to be charcoal. They depicted a figure, tall and thin, with too many joints in its limbs, and a face that was just a smooth oval. In every drawing, the figure was standing in the same place, right behind whoever was looking at the drawing. Thomas Whitlock told his men to stay close. He told them not to separate under any circumstances. He told them they would search the cabin systematically, document everything, and leave within the hour. These were the last coherent orders Thomas Whitlock ever gave, because that's when they heard the sound coming from the hole in the floor, not the clicking anymore, something worse. Something that sounded exactly like Deputy Frank Holloway's voice, calling up from the darkness, asking them please to come help him. And Deputy Frank Holloway was standing right next to them when they heard it. There are conflicting accounts of what happened in the next 17 minutes. This is because trauma does strange things to memory, and because the three men who survived gave their statements at different times, in different mental states, and with different levels of coherence. But certain facts remain consistent across all three testimonies. Deputy Holloway heard his own voice calling from the hole. They all heard it. But more than that, the voice knew things. It knew the name of Holloway's daughter, Sarah, who was 4 years old. It knew the lullaby he sang to her at night, a song his own mother had sung to him, a song nobody else in Ashmore would have known, and the voice was singing it, down in that darkness, in perfect pitch, with perfect timing, except the words were wrong. Instead of, "Hush, little baby, don't you cry," the voice was singing, "Hush, little Sarah, it's your time." Marcus Webb grabbed Holloway's arm to stop him from approaching the hole. But Dr. Pritchard was already moving toward it. Not because he wanted to, he explained later. Because he felt compelled. He said it was like being a child again, being called to dinner, knowing you had to obey even though every instinct was screaming at you to run. He knelt at the edge of the hole. He shined his flashlight down, and he saw his wife. Catherine Pritchard had died in childbirth in 1949. She'd been dead for 4 years. She was buried in the Ashmore Cemetery, in a plot that James visited every Sunday after church. But she was in the hole beneath the Hollow Ridge cabin, standing at the bottom, looking up at him with her arms outstretched, asking him why he'd left her alone in the dark for so long. James Pritchard screamed. He dropped his flashlight into the hole, and they all watched it fall, tumbling end over end, the beam illuminating nothing but dirt walls that went down and down and down, far deeper than should have been possible, far deeper than the earth itself. Thomas Whitlock made a decision then that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He decided they needed to go down into the hole. He decided they needed to investigate the source of these voices, these visions, because that was his job. That was what a sheriff did. He confronted the inexplicable and brought back answers. Marcus Webb argued with him, begged him, told him that whatever was down there wasn't something you investigated, it was something you ran from. But Thomas had that look in his eyes, the look of a man who'd already made up his mind, who'd already convinced himself that courage meant moving forward, even when forward meant descending into a hole that whispered your secrets back at you. They found a rope in their vehicle, 50 feet of good climbing rope that Marcus had brought from his military days. They anchored it to one of the cabin's support beams. Thomas went first. He tied the rope around his waist and lowered himself into the hole, his flashlight clenched between his teeth, his revolver in his right hand. Deputy Holloway went second, despite his fear, because leaving your sheriff to go down alone wasn't something you did in 1953, wasn't something you could live with afterward. Dr. Pritchard went third, still crying, still calling his dead wife's name. Marcus Webb stayed at the top. He was the anchor. He was the one who would pull them back up when they were ready to come back. He wrapped the rope around his body and braced himself against the cabin wall and watched 3 lights descend into darkness that should not have existed. For the first 30 feet, they reported normal geological features, dirt walls, tree roots, the occasional stone. Their voices echoed strangely, but they could still hear each other. Thomas kept up a steady commentary, describing what he saw, maintaining the pretense that this was a standard investigation. Then, at approximately 40 feet, which should have put them well below the cabin's foundation, well below any reasonable excavation depth, the walls changed. They weren't dirt anymore. They were wood, carved wood, and the carvings were names, thousands of names, maybe tens of thousands, carved in letters so small you needed to put your face inches from the wall to read them. Thomas recognized some of the names. They were from Ashmore. They were from the cemetery. They were the names of everyone who'd ever died in that town going back 100 years. And at the bottom of the list, still being carved by something they couldn't see, something that worked in the darkness just beyond their flashlight beams, were 3 new names. Thomas Whitlock, Frank Holloway, James Pritchard. That's when the rope went slack. Marcus Webb, up at the surface, felt it happen. One moment he was bracing against the weight of 3 grown men. The next moment there was no weight at all. He pulled the rope up, hand over hand, faster and faster. It came up empty. The end wasn't frayed. It wasn't cut. It was untied, as if the 3 men had simply decided to let go and continue descending on their own. Marcus Webb ran. He ran back to the vehicle, drove back to Ashmore, and went straight to the sheriff's office, where he told them everything in a stream of words that didn't quite make sense, but communicated the essential horror of what he'd witnessed. A search party was organized within the hour. 12 men, 3 vehicles, every flashlight and lantern the town possessed. They reached Hollow Ridge by 2 in the afternoon. The cabin was still there. The door was still open, but the hole in the floor was gone. The floorboards were intact, undisturbed, as if they'd never been torn up at all. The scratch marks on the walls were gone too. The cabin was completely, utterly empty, except for the smell. That smell of wet leather and spoiled meat and chemical sweetness. That smell remained. For 3 days, the town of Ashmore existed in a state of suspended horror. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock was missing. Deputy Frank Holloway was missing. Dr. James Pritchard was missing. The county police were called in. The state police were notified. Search dogs were brought to Hollow Ridge, but they refused to approach the cabin. They would get within 20 yards, then stop, hackles raised, whining in a way their handlers had never heard before. One dog, a bloodhound named Rex, who'd found 6 missing persons in his career, sat down in the dirt and howled for 40 minutes straight until his handler finally took him away. The search expanded to a 5-mile radius around the cabin. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined. They searched in grid patterns, calling names, looking for any sign of the missing men. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the cabin, no disturbed vegetation, no articles of clothing, nothing. It was as if Thomas Whitlock and his companions had simply ceased to exist the moment they'd entered that building. Marcus Webb was questioned repeatedly. The county police were suspicious of his story. A hole that disappeared, voices from the darkness, names carved in wood that shouldn't have been there. It sounded like the ravings of a man who'd done something terrible and was trying to cover it with an impossible story. But Marcus Webb was a decorated war veteran with no history of mental illness and no conceivable motive, and when they polygraphed him, he passed. Every single question. Either he was telling the truth, or he believed his own delusions so completely that the machine couldn't detect a lie. Eleanor Marsh, the school teacher who'd first reported the Morse code signals, told the county police something she hadn't told Sheriff Whitlock. She'd been having dreams about the cabin for weeks before the disturbances started. Dreams where she walked through rooms that didn't exist. Rooms that stretched on forever. Rooms filled with people she recognized from old photographs. People who'd been dead for decades. In the dreams, they were all waiting for something. They were all facing the same direction, toward a door at the end of the longest room. A door that was slowly opening. On the evening of November 17th, 1953, 3 days after the men had disappeared, a farmer named Dale Ricketts was driving past Hollow Ridge on his way home. It was just after sunset. The fog had rolled in thick, the way it always did in that part of the woods. Dale wasn't paying particular attention to the cabin. He'd made this drive 1,000 times. But something made him look. Maybe it was movement. Maybe it was instinct. He saw a figure standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead. Dale slowed his truck. The figure didn't move. As he got closer, his headlights illuminated the shape. It was a man, naked, covered in dirt. standing perfectly still with his arms at his sides. Dale stopped the truck 20 feet away. He recognized the face, even through the dirt and the blood and the something else that was wrong with it. It was Sheriff Thomas Whitlock. Dale got out of his truck slowly, calling Thomas's name, asking if he was all right, knowing even as he said it that nothing was all right, that nothing would be all right again. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at Dale. He was looking past him, at something in the distance, something only Thomas could see. His mouth was moving, forming words without sound, the same words, over and over. Dale approached carefully. He reached out to touch Thomas's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Thomas began to scream. Not a scream of pain, not a scream of fear, a scream of absolute, existential horror. The kind of sound that shouldn't be able to come from a human throat. He screamed and kept screaming, and he didn't stop to breathe. He just screamed in one continuous note that went on until Dale Ricketts got back in his truck and drove to town as fast as his vehicle would go. When they returned with help, Thomas was still standing in the same spot, still screaming. They had to physically restrain him to get him into a vehicle. They took him to Dr. Halloran's office, the only other physician in town besides the missing Dr. Pritchard. They sedated him. They cleaned him. They examined him. Physically, he was unharmed. No injuries. No signs of exposure. His body temperature was normal. His heart rate was elevated but stable. But he wouldn't stop screaming. Even sedated, even unconscious, the scream continued, muffled now but still there, still vibrating in his chest. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Dr. Halloran kept Thomas sedated for 18 hours. When the sedation finally wore off, the screaming stopped. Thomas opened his eyes. He looked around the room, at the faces gathered there, his wife, his deputies, the county police, Marcus Webb, and he spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the words were clear. He said, "They're still down there. Frank and James, they're still down there. And they want to come home." Then he told them what he'd seen in the hole beneath Hollow Ridge, and what he said made the county police seal every record of the incident for the next 50 years. Thomas Whitlock's official statement was taken on November 19, 1953, in the presence of 2 county police officers, Dr. Halloran, and a court stenographer named Margaret Pine. Margaret was 71 years old. She'd been transcribing legal proceedings for 43 years. She'd documented murder confessions, asylum commitments, and custody battles that had torn families apart. But she said later that Thomas Whitlock's testimony was the only one that ever made her stop typing. The only one that made her hands shake so badly she had to leave the room. The transcript still exists. It's buried in the Marion County archives under a classification that doesn't officially exist anymore. But people have read it. Researchers, journalists, family members of the missing men who demanded answers. And everyone who's read it says the same thing. The words on the page don't capture what Thomas actually said. They don't capture the tone of his voice, the flatness of it, like he was reading from a script written in a language he didn't quite understand. They don't capture the way he never blinked during the entire 2-hour testimony. Not once. Thomas said that when the rope went slack, they didn't let go. The rope let go of them. It untied itself from their waists, moved like a living thing, and retreated back up the hole while they watched. They were standing on solid ground at that point, approximately 60 feet below the cabin. But it wasn't dirt anymore. It was stone. Smooth stone that felt warm to the touch, almost body temperature. And the walls weren't walls anymore. They were doorways. Dozens of doorways. Hundreds. All leading into rooms that shouldn't have been able to exist in the space they occupied. Thomas shined his flashlight into the nearest doorway and saw his childhood home, not a replica, the actual house where he'd grown up in Kentucky, a house that had burned down in 1929. He could see his mother standing in the kitchen, her back to him, washing dishes. He called to her. She turned around, and her face was his exact face, down to the scar on his chin from a childhood fall, superimposed on his mother's body. Deputy Holloway went through a different doorway. Thomas tried to stop him, but Frank moved with the same compulsion that had drawn Dr. Pritchard to the hole in the first place. He walked into a room that looked like his daughter's bedroom, except the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting, and in the bed, under the covers, something small was crying. Frank went to the bed. He pulled back the covers. What he found there made him start laughing. Thomas said it was the worst sound he'd ever heard, worse than any scream, that laughter that went on and on while Frank looked at whatever was in his daughter's bed. Dr. Pritchard found his wife. Not a vision this time. Catherine Pritchard, in the flesh, exactly as she'd been before she died. She was in a room that looked like their bedroom, sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair. She smiled when she saw James. She stood up. She walked toward him with her arms open. And James embraced her. Thomas watched from the doorway. He watched James hold his dead wife. And he watched as Catherine's face began to change. Her features stayed the same, but something underneath them shifted. Like there were too many bones in her skull, trying to arrange themselves into the right shape, but not quite succeeding. Catherine whispered something in James's ear. Thomas couldn't hear what she said, but he saw James's expression change, saw him pull back, saw him try to let go of her. And Catherine held on, her arms wrapped tighter, her fingers pressed into James's back, and Thomas could see them sinking in, disappearing into flesh that should have been solid. James was screaming now. Frank was still laughing, and Thomas Whitlock made a decision that he would never forgive himself for. He ran. He ran back through the doorways, back toward the stone chamber where they'd first descended. He could hear footsteps behind him. Multiple footsteps. Not just his companions. Others. Many others. He didn't look back. Looking back felt like something that would cost him more than his life. He found a staircase he hadn't noticed before, carved into the stone, leading upward. He climbed. His legs burned. His lungs screamed. The footsteps were getting closer, and he could hear voices now, calling his name. Dozens of voices. Some he recognized, some he didn't. His mother's voice, his father's voice, Sheriff Clayton Moss's voice. The voices of every person he'd ever known who died, all of them asking him the same question. Why did you leave us down here? Thomas climbed for what felt like hours but might have been minutes. Time didn't work correctly in that place. He emerged, not through the hole in the cabin floor, but through the ground itself, 30 yards from the cabin, clawing his way up through dirt that parted for him like water. He stood on the surface. He saw the cabin. He saw the fog. He saw the trees. And he understood that he'd made it out. But Frank and James hadn't. They were still down there. Still in those rooms. Still being held by things that wore familiar faces. The county police asked Thomas if he could lead them back to the entrance. If they could mount a rescue operation. Thomas looked at them with eyes that didn't seem to focus properly anymore. He said no. He said you couldn't rescue someone from a place that wasn't a place. You couldn't save someone who'd stopped being themselves. And then he said something that made the senior officer present immediately classify the entire case. Thomas said, "It's not a hole, it's not a cave, it's a mouth, and Hollow Ridge is where it comes up to breathe. It's been breathing for a long time, longer than Ashmore has existed, longer than West Virginia has been a state. Every 30 years or so, it takes a deep breath, and when it does, people disappear." I looked at the records, 1873, 1903, 1933, now 1953. Every 30 years. Families, individuals, sometimes entire groups, all near Hollow Ridge, all gone without a trace. And in 1983, it's going to breathe again, and again, in 2013. And it will keep breathing until someone figures out what it wants or how to make it stop. Thomas Whitlock was placed under psychiatric observation. The official report stated he was suffering from a severe dissociative episode brought on by trauma. He was institutionalized at the Western State Hospital, where he would remain, still screaming periodically, still whispering about the rooms beneath Hollow Ridge, until his death in 1967. He was 49 years old. Deputy Frank Holloway and Dr. James Pritchard were never found. They were declared legally dead in 1955. The search was officially closed, the case files were sealed, and Hollow Ridge was left alone. The cabin at Hollow Ridge still stands. You can find it if you know where to look, if you're willing to drive 9 miles outside what's left of Ashmore, West Virginia, into woods that feel older than they should, where the fog never quite lifts and the birds don't sing the way they do everywhere else. The county tried to tear it down in 1968. They sent a demolition crew with bulldozers and chainsaws. The crew spent 3 days trying to knock down a single-story wooden structure. The wood wouldn't break. The nails wouldn't pull free. On the 4th day, the foreman reported that the cabin was bigger on the inside than the outside, that when you measured the exterior walls, you got one set of dimensions, but when you measured the interior rooms, the numbers didn't match. They were off by approximately 6 feet in every direction, 6 feet of space that existed inside but not outside. The demolition was abandoned. The cabin was left standing. A chain-link fence was erected around the property with no trespassing signs posted every 10 feet. For a few years, people respected the fence. Then, in 1983, exactly 30 years after Thomas Whitlock disappeared into the hole, 3 college students from Marshall University decided to investigate the legend. They brought cameras. They brought recording equipment. They spent one night in the cabin. 2 of them made it out. The third, a young woman named Andrea Cole, was found 3 days later, standing in the middle of Route 19, naked and covered in dirt, screaming in a voice that sounded like Sheriff Thomas Whitlock's voice, using words Thomas had used, saying, "They're still down there and they want to come home." Andrea Cole was institutionalized. The 2 students who'd escaped wouldn't speak about what they'd seen. The footage from their cameras was confiscated by local police and, according to reports, destroyed. But one of the students, a man named Derek Mills, gave a single interview to a local newspaper before he left West Virginia and never returned. He said they'd found the hole. It was there, in the center of the floor, exactly where it had always been. And at the bottom of the hole, they'd seen people, dozens of people, standing in perfect rows, facing upward, waiting. Derek said he'd recognized some of them from old photographs in the Ashmore Library. The Carver family, Deputy Holloway, Dr. Pritchard, others he didn't know, all of them standing in the darkness, all of them smiling, all of them looking up at the students with expressions that Derek described as hungry. In 2013, another cycle came. A hiker went missing near Hollow Ridge, then a couple whose car broke down on the nearby road. Then a real estate developer who'd purchased the land, intending to clear it for a housing development. All gone within a 2-week period in November. All found eventually, days later, miles from where they'd disappeared, unable to speak, unable to explain where they'd been. One of them, the real estate developer, a man named Charles Thorne, eventually recovered enough to give a statement. He said he'd been in rooms, endless rooms, rooms that looked like every place he'd ever lived, every office he'd ever worked in, every hotel he'd ever stayed in on business trips, and in each room, there was someone waiting, someone who knew him, someone who looked almost right but not quite, someone who wanted him to stay. The pattern holds. Every 30 years, every time, people go missing near Hollow Ridge. Every time, some of them come back wrong, changed, speaking in voices that aren't quite theirs, knowing things they shouldn't know, waking up screaming about rooms that go on forever and doorways that lead to places that shouldn't exist. The next cycle is 2043. 20 years from now. The cabin will still be standing. The fence will still be there, though it's falling apart now, rusted and broken in places where people have climbed through, people who don't believe the stories, or who believe them too much, who want to see for themselves, who think they'll be different, who think they'll be the ones to solve the mystery. Marcus Webb, the only man who went to Hollow Ridge in 1953 and came back unchanged, lived until 1997. Before he died, he gave an interview to a researcher from West Virginia University who was documenting Appalachian folklore. Marcus was 83 years old. His mind was still sharp. His memory was still clear. He said he thought about Hollow Ridge every single day of his life since November 14, 1953. He said he could still hear Thomas Whitlock's voice calling to him sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, asking him to come back, asking him to bring others, asking him to feed the thing that lived beneath the cabin. The researcher asked Marcus what he thought was down there, what the hole really was, where it led. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that the researcher wrote down word for word. He said, "It's not a hole. It's not a cave. Thomas was right about that. It's a mouth, but it's also a stomach, and we're what it digests, not our bodies, our stories, our memories, everything we are, everything we were, everyone we loved. It takes all of that and keeps it. And the worst part is, the people down there, the ones who didn't make it back, they're not dead. They're still conscious, still aware, still experiencing every moment, but they're not themselves anymore. They're part of it now, part of whatever's been living under that land since before there were names for things, since before there were people to name them. And it's patient. It can wait 30 years between meals. It can wait 100 years, 1,000. It's been there longer than we can imagine, and it will be there long after Ashmore is gone, after West Virginia is gone, after everyone who's ever heard this story is dead and forgotten. The researcher asked Marcus why he was telling this story, if it was true. Why spread the legend? Why risk drawing more people to Hollow Ridge? Marcus looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had spent 44 years looking over his shoulder, waiting for something that never quite caught up to him. He said, "Because it doesn't matter. It will feed regardless. But at least if people know, if they really know, maybe some of them will stay away. Maybe some of them will survive the next cycle. And maybe, eventually, someone smarter than me will figure out how to kill it. No one has figured that out yet. The Hollow Ridge cabin is still there. The hole is still beneath it, whether you can see it or not. And in 2043, it will breathe again. Somewhere, right now, there are people who don't know they're already marked. People who will find themselves driving past Hollow Ridge on a foggy November evening. People who will hear voices they recognize calling from the woods. People who will see lights moving behind those cabin windows in patterns that spell out messages meant only for them. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock broke into that cabin 72 years ago, looking for answers. What he found instead was a question that no one has been able to answer. Not what is Hollow Ridge, but what is it hungry for? And why, after all this time, after all these cycles, after all these disappearances, does it keep calling people back? The last words in Thomas Whitlock's psychiatric file, written by a doctor who treated him in 1966, a year before his death, are these: "Patient remains convinced that Deputy Holloway and Dr. Pritchard are alive. Patient states they are waiting for him. Patient states they forgive him for leaving them behind. Patient states that when he dies, he will join them in the rooms beneath Hollow Ridge, and that he is grateful for this." Patient smiles when he says this. It is not a human smile. If you've watched this far, you know more than most people will ever know about Hollow Ridge. You know what happened to Sheriff Thomas Whitlock. You know what's waiting beneath that cabin, and you know that in 2043, it will happen again. The only question is whether you'll be one of the people who stays away, or one of the people who, despite everything you've heard, despite every warning, decides to see for themselves. Some stories don't have endings. They have cycles. And Hollow Ridge has been cycling for longer than anyone can remember. In a place where the fog doesn't lift, where the birds don't sing, where a cabin stands that shouldn't exist, built on top of a mouth that's still hungry, still breathing, still waiting for the next person to open the door. Thank you for watching. If this story disturbed you the way it was meant to, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're from. Tell us if you've ever heard of places like Hollow Ridge in your town. Places where people don't go. Places with stories that are too specific to be made up. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who thinks they're brave enough to investigate legends, share it with them. Not as entertainment, as a warning, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some places, once they know your name, never forget it.